This Rav4 was making some noise that changed with engine RPM, very noticeable at an idle. So I suspected a pulley or a water pump, and I was able to get a noise but not able to isolate it. So I wanted to gain access to the area and take off the drive belt. So to do that, I'm taking off the coolant reservoir, or moving it to the side rather, and then I'm taking off plastic covers and getting things out of the way so I have access to the area, not only to take off the drive belt to spin pulleys and the water pump and isolate the noise, but to also make repairs in the area as needed. So I took off plastic covers and this right hand suspension support bracket, and then I'm also supporting the engine on a block of wood on a jack there, so I can take off this top motor mount that's over the belt on that side. 17mm nut and some bolts. And then it was still holding on by a 15mm nut on the bottom, so I came up at that from the bottom with a long extension. And once that was out, I was able to manipulate the height of the engine to get the tension off of the mount by moving the jack up and down and working it out of there. That gave me good access to the tensioner arm here with a 19mm head that you can rotate clockwise to relieve tension on the belt. So I got a socket on there and a ratchet, and applied leverage from the top while I pulled it off the crank pulley on the bottom. I found that easiest. And then because the belt was new, within the last 5,000 or 10,000 miles, I didn't need to replace it, so I just moved it off to the side and then spun my pulleys in the water pump, and I found that the water pump pulley there was very dry and had a lot of vibration in it, and I have a high degree of confidence that's the source of my noise. So I'm going to get access to the water pump area and replace it. I'm disconnecting the battery here so that when I take off this particular connection it's not hot. And then I'm just putting that nut back in place so it stays where it belongs. Disconnecting all the harness stuff that's in the way. That's the crankshaft position sensor connector. And then taking out the 14mm bolts. There's two of them, one on the bottom and then one up on the top side. Once those were out, I was able to work free the alternator and finagle it out of there. With the alternator out of the way, I have good access to the water pump. Before I get too ambitious in taking that out, I'm going to dump the coolant from the system. There's a petcock drain valve below the driver's side lower radiator hose, so I'm going to open that up, dump it into a drain pan, open up the reservoir to vent it, and it'll drain a little quicker. And then I'm using a pry bar as a brake, and so that I can break free these water pump pulley bolts without spinning the pulley itself. Take out those 4 bolts, and that'll give me access to the water pump bolts that hold it to the block. There's 4 bolts and 2 nuts that hold it in place. These 2 that are visible here also hold a bracket that for the crankshaft position sensor harness. So fold that out of the way, and then remove the other bolts holding the water pump on. One of them, with how I was set up on the hoist, it was easier for me to get the bottom one from the bottom side. Then I put the drain pan in place there and knocked the water pump loose with the end of a pry bar. spinning it again by hand, and really rough, noisy, and the new one's really smooth and clean and makes no noise. And then I'm preparing the surface for the new gasket. Kind of tedious using a gasket scraper, scrub brush, razor blade. I'm dragging it so that I don't gouge into the aluminum and have a spot where I have a potential for leak. And then clean out some of the grime that I got in there. It's not going to do any harm if you get a little bit of grime into the cooling system. Large passageways and no high tolerance parts in there. Water pump's really the only thing moving in the cooling system. Toyota calls for a 2.5mm bead of RTV silicone. I'm using a Permatex water pump in thermostat silicone. And then I'm going to set it in place and put the nuts on over the studs. And then I'll put in all the other bolts, and I'm just going to lightly tighten them up. I'm not going to cinch them down just yet to spec. I'm going to give that silicone a little bit of time to set up and get tacky before I fully squeeze it. And then go ahead and tighten everything down, 80 inch-pounds. Clean up the inside of the pulley, and then put it back on the water pump. And then I'm going to use the pry bar again as a brake for tightening them up the way I did when I loosened them up. 19 foot-pounds is what it's called for. I'm not going for great precision here because those are still bolts into a steel pulley, and unlike the other ones that are going into the aluminum block, I want to be pretty precise with those. I forgot to put the harness in, and so I took that bolt and that nut back off, and luckily I didn't have to take the pulley off again to do that. Put that harness back in place, tighten everything up, and then work the alternator back into the bracket. The torque spec is 38 foot-pounds for the top one, 16 foot-pounds for the bottom one. Putting all the connections back on. And then routing the belt and slipping it over the water pump last was easiest for me. And then it's back in with the mount, so manipulating the jack height again to get it to line up and to fit in easily. All the top bolts in the nut are 70 foot-pounds. The bottom one's 38 foot-pounds. I forgot to do it here. You'll see later that I put in that nut last from the bottom. Reservoir's going back in. Battery connections hooked back up, adding the coolant. And then I'm going to run it, get it up to operating temperature, and check the level again. Here I'm checking to see if the thermostat opened up, see if both of my radiator hoses are hot and have fluid cycling through them. And once I got it at the correct level with fluid completely circulating, I know that it'll be good. You could let it cool down. Next morning, come out and check the fluid again to be sure. Putting in all the guards and brackets and stuff, whatnot, back in place. And then I had to undo it again so I could slide in this last 15mm nut on that motor mount. And then once I did that, I started up and ran it. It was a lot quieter, sounded really smooth and nice, and I took care of the problem. Hope you found that useful. Thanks for watching. I hope you like and subscribe.